And we're live. Kate?
Hi, we are live. It is Friday, September 18th, 2020. The show has been taken over by Kate's, and Ben is frozen in a corner. It's really just kind of like a dream. That's like, well, except that he can still talk. So,
I
so
can talk.
I know, I'm just Anyway, we were going to do a lamb prosciutto tasting today on In Lieu of Fun, which we hopefully will still do when Ben becomes unfrozen. But we will save the monologue for when Ben is unfrozen and we can take a break in the discussion. But in lieu of fun, so hold on, I messed it up. See, I don't usually do the introduction. Ben's much better at this. We don't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, we have Kate Starbird. Star Starboard. Sorry. Now Ben's camera has taken over, and so have now his entire, yeah. Anyway, hi, Kate. You have come to us on a day of exceptional tech hardship, but we are thrilled to have you. Um, and just by way of introduction to the audience, Kate is a professor at the University of Washington. She has become one of the leading scholars on misinformation, disinformation. I don't think you ever planned on being and we'll talk about this today, a expert on misinformation about the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. But you have your work has been kind of put you in this unique position to be writing about everything that's happening right now, from fake news in elections to fake news in medical science to fake news full stop. And so thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Welcome.
Ben from the darkness. This is especially sad because, just FY, for those who were here a little bit earlier, Ben is wearing a really good dog shirt today. And so
You're going to get to see the dog shirt. You're going to get to see the lamb prosciutto.
Okay.
It's all going to happen for you. For now, I am reduced to a disembodied voice, but I'm the kind of disembodied voice you want in a conversation like this. So cheer up.
Yeah. So Kate, I met you when you were visiting at the Alex Stamos, who has come on the show a number of times, at the Internet Observatory that he kind of put together, and he was studying and working on these issues. I think I met you, maybe it was the end-to-end encryption conference, maybe something else. But in any event, your work has been kind of in the fore of all of the stuff that I've been looking at around disinformation. I kind of go to you and Joan Donovan and a few other people before anyone else. So I'm really interested. When I was looking up your bio, it kind of said that you had looked at information systems in crisis and in times of crisis. And that was what kind of, and I don't know if that was your thesis for your PhD or kind of what that was, but I didn't know that about you. And so now I'm just kind of so tell us a little bit about how you started studying that and how it ended up pivoting into such everything, kind of the entire universe coalesced around your expertise.
Yeah, that is an interesting, I don't know if it's good luck or bad luck. It depends on how you look at it. But yeah, no, I started a PhD in 2007. I was at the University of Colorado, and I ran into a professor there, Lieu Palin. And she was the smartest person I thought I'd ever met, and probably still have ever met. She was just brilliant, and she was working on this new field called crisis informatics, which looks at the intersection of information communication technologies and human behavior. And so she was studying that. I was like, I should be studying whatever she's studying because I want to be in her lab. And so I started studying social media, the use of social media during crisis events. And in particular, I was actually looking at all the pro-social things that happen after a crisis event.
What years was this?
2007 to 2012.
Okay, so a while ago.
Yeah, and so
internet years.
did our first, I was late there, so they'd already been doing a couple of studies. I think they looked at the Virginia Tech shootings using Facebook, looking at Facebook use during the Virginia Tech shootings. That was prior to my joining her lab. And then we started looking at Twitter data circa 2009 in the context of different kinds of crisis events. Maybe even I think they had some in 2008, but my first studies were in 2009. And looking again at like how people share information, organize, help each other, help their neighbors, help people halfway across the world during crisis events using social media. So it was actually like the worst of times, but we were studying the best of human behavior. And that changed for me in the last few years. When I moved over to the University of Washington, wrote a couple grants on disaster volunteerism, but our first grants hit on the study of misinformation after crisis events online. And then pretty soon, we got a few grants in that. And then around 2014, 15, we start to recognize we're not just seeing sort of accidental misinformation, but pervasive disinformation in some of the same places, same phenomena we've been studying for a long time, but the pieces that were related to spreading disinformation became bigger parts of the network and more salient in the discourse.
So just could you give a two sentence like summary for people about like the difference between the terminology for those who study it in misinformation, disinformation?
Yeah, so misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false.
Yeah,
after a crisis event, it's an intent thing, right? And but it's a little bit more interesting than that. But yeah, so and disinformation is sort of false or misleading information that has a purpose, sort of an objective behind it. It's being spread because someone wants you to think that. And so usually we can think about like political objectives, but we also see disinformation spreading for financial objectives or even just reputational objectives. People want to grow their networks.
So is there strategic misinformation, or is strategic like a word that should only modify disinformation?
Yeah, I don't know. There's so
That's
many
like
different places to have tension in the semantics of things. But I would say when something is strategic misinformation, that's disinformation. That's the definition of disinformation. And there's a lot of movement in these terms as people are trying to figure out how to best talk about them, and and then also how they the terms that we use start to get appropriated and used to perpetuate the things that we want to, like fake news gets appropriated and then becomes almost a useless term. Even disinformation is being appropriated and becoming almost a useless term in some cases. So there's like, I think the vocabulary is going to be dynamic and continue to be dynamic as we figure things out. And as
how is the term disinformation becoming appropriated? That I have not seen.
Oh, the people that are purveying, that are pushing disinformation are constantly accusing everyone else of being disinformation as well. Yes. Just in the same way that fake news was kind of turned back onto journalism, sort of professional journalism, we see disinformation being turned back on journalists, researchers of disinformation. Yes, I mean, if you look at the networks that we study that are conducting disinformation, they say that others are using disinformation against them.
So that's kind of, I am glad Ben asked that question, because I actually was I wanted to go there, but I also was gonna ask, like, that reminds me of this story after the 2016 election in which everyone was suddenly massively aware of this thing called fake news and of this thing called like coordinated mis or disinformation, and like that, like Claire Wardell published her very excellent kind of like and preliminary, I think it's like been updated. Hopefully it has been updated. Again, this is not my direct area, but it has like kind of gotten some nuance. But she like published a taxonomy of like how to understand these various things. It was useful at a very basic level, but it's still useful. And like, but I also like, but I also just wanted to mention something that you said, which is that fake news was a thing that implied journalism, because I think I'm curious about whether you think that's still the case, because it certainly was the case in 2016. I was in all of these closed door Chatham House rule sessions with like the general counsel of the New York Times and Washington Post at like Yale and at Harvard, and talking about the internet and talking about how we're going to fix the internet and how we're going to fix the internet with the help of newsrooms to combat fake news. And like, I was like, wait, I'm like really confused. Like, I thought we were talking about fake news as spam. Like, how is how is the New York Times going to solve that problem? And there was just and just there was no cohesion to the language to discuss the problem, and it was such a frustrating series of dialogues. And it really was not until like a couple of years later that there started to become like normative understandings and like definitions for these things. I'm just
Yeah.
curious, like you've been doing this since like 2007. Like, do you feel like those terms changing and like what they imply changing all the time?
Yeah. Well, yes, there's still some shift in terminology. And that's kind of natural to happen when there's like a lot of convergence and new people coming from different places. The way that we were using these terms was pretty loose, and all of a sudden you need a tighter distinction for what disinformation is and what it means, and some of these other terms. So the fact that there was change isn't that surprising. I think that the pace of change is slowing down as we're converging on some shared understandings. But with the term like fake news, we actually could see it being weaponized. And turned against itself. The media came out and said, oh, look, fake news is this huge problem. We've got these clickbait farms, we've got these other kinds of things, and this very low quality news. And then a few months later, that term had been appropriated and turned back on as an attack on journalism. And I'll never forget, like, my parents are just tapped into the right-wing media sphere, and I get a call from one of them, and they say, oh, I finally understand what you mean by fake news and the problem of fake news. And, look at what the New York Times is doing right now. And I thought, yeah, it's not exactly what I meant by fake news, and so I can't use that term anymore. So you could see that.
How much is the change in the meaning of the term fake news simply the president appropriating the term to refer to his critics? And how much is it a more general? I mean, that seems like an example with a single cause with a name, no?
I think he picked up something that was already being used by others to undermine journalism. I think he picked it up because it worked, and certainly now it's much more widespread because of him. It's hard to, if you took it out of the system, yes, maybe it wouldn't be as strong, but we were already seeing it used in some of the sort of alternative media spheres that we look at that spread a lot of low quality content and disinformation. We were already seeing them kind of trying to weaponize that term before Trump picked it up. So he was actually reflecting what seemed to already be working, which is a lot of his style anyways, is to see what kinds of narratives are working and then appropriate them and spread them further.
Interesting. So yeah, go ahead, Ben.
So talk about the trends that you're seeing now with both the election and COVID.
I didn't quite hear you there, but...
Sorry, let me say that again. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So talk about the trends you're seeing now in disinformation, both with respect to the election and with respect to COVID.
Well, I'm glad you have an hour because those are huge questions. So I guess in terms of, let's start with COVID. I think if we look at sort of the trajectory of what happened, we're going to see a period of actually a lot of misinformation that was spreading early on. So a lot of things that were just sort of rumors that were getting started and spreading, but not necessarily with malicious intent or some sort of a kind of political objective. Over time, because of the extended uncertainty and the extended disruption of COVID-19, it's just been a lot of time for the rumor mill to just continue to spin. And so I think we do have seen sort of a shift from like those sort of accidental rumors that turn out to be misinformation to more sort of conspiracy theorizing, and then politicization of misinformation, and then even more disinformation as we begin to as COVID-19 begins to converge with election 2020 kinds of things, and different kinds of narratives are politically useful for people in trying to get elected in different parts of the ticket. And so you can see this kind of mobilization both conspiracy theories, of rumors, and even of completely sort of from the get-go disinformation narratives, and see them push through the system. So there's a lot going on. It's hard to keep up in the moment of all the kind of information operations that we're seeing at any one time, and we're trying to do that in sort of real time. Just part of that with a project called the Election Integrity Partnership. And there's just, you can't keep up with it all. Even with a team of 40 people we have right now, it's hard to keep up with all of the different information operations that are happening. And most of what we're seeing is domestic. Right?
So no, say more about that. Like who is it? Like what is so much of, I wonder how much of this, I'm curious if you gave like a split on this type of stuff. Like there is a certain amount of like organic misinformation is probably is obviously more organic than disinformation.
Yeah.
But one could be like disinformation can then become misinformation, right? Like, well, like, I mean, like you could accidentally believe something and pass it on.
Yeah, so I think that's actually an interesting place, because I've disagreed with some of my own PhD students on this. I think something that starts out as disinformation, it remains disinformation no matter who is spreading it.
It's like
even if you're accidental, even if
like it's just the radiation spreads everything.
It's a disinformation. The disinformation campaign wants people to spread it. They want people to believe it and spread it, but it remains disinformation. I also think that misinformation that emerges organically can become disinformation when it starts to be leveraged by disinformation campaigns who understand it maybe not to be true, but it's useful, and so they can amplify. So you'll see disinformation campaigns amplify conspiracy theory narratives, and the narratives themselves were emergent and organic, but the disinformation campaign weaponizes them.
They're like, oh, that's a good one. That seems like a good one that people came up with.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you're,
we didn't even think of that.
Well, then you can crowdsource it to get the best narratives that seem to work the best. I mean, you can see that with Seth Rich stuff. You can see that if you look back. I mean, the old example of the Soviet Union claiming that AIDS was bioengineered by the U.S. government. I looked at Thomas Rid's book. He actually traces that back. The first time you hear that is actually from American activists, but it didn't spread very far. But then the Soviet Union picked it up and spread it all over the world. So they didn't create it, but it became a tool for their political objectives.
So Thomas Rid has been on the show, but Ben, you should go ahead and ask your question. But I was just going to say that, so active measures is disinformation in like the same way, but it just like is a coordinate, like it's more coordinated by like one national government.
I think disinformation is a tool of active measures. Active measures can be broader than that, but disinformation is one tool of active measures.
Got it.
And Thomas Rid has done a great job of explaining that there's a blurring between activism and active measures. So active measures can be used by governments, but the tools of active measures are now available to almost anyone. And we can see activists who are picking them up on their own, whether they have funding or not. Like at this point, you can pick up some of the tools of disinformation and start your own campaign with just a few extra hours a week, and start trying to make a difference there. So it becomes hard to disentangle political operations that have some funding behind them from this sort of emergent, just like motivated people who want to share with you that they got 2 ballots and that therefore the election is rigged. That, even though they didn't necessarily determine that there actually weren't ballots that they're receiving, there's something else, right? So it's hard, someone kind of spreading these narratives organically is hard to differentiate between these political campaigns, especially when they begin to echo each other.
So I'm interested in the relationship between disinformation and foreign interference. When we say disinformation in the United States post-2016, it has this overlay of Russian involvement in the 2016 election, interference in the campaign. But most disinformation is domestic in origin, has limited foreign involvement, and is just basically assholes lying for one reason or another, right? It's Alex Jones or Fox News perpetuating, or comparable stuff on the left, right? People get ideas in their heads and propagate them, either knowing that they're false or not caring that they're false. And so my question is, are we overly concerned about disinformation of a foreign origin, where really the problem is the quality of the information ecosystem, and we should just chill out about the source of the disinformation and really focus on improving the system's ability to assimilate disinformation, rebut it, and be resilient from it? Or is there really something special about when the Russians are coming, or the Chinese are, using Mulan to spread, information about, they're not actually, but they are using it to spread propaganda about Xinjiang and Uyghurs. Like, how much should we care if the disinformation is domestic or foreign?
I'm going to answer this maybe not in the most straightforward way, but in 2016, there was rhetorical and persuasive power to highlighting where the disinformation was foreign. And I think we had a case where actually there were information operations of all kinds happening. But we were able to identify this piece of it that was coming from outside. And it was easier to say, hey, that's not political speech. That's not freedom of speech. That's something that's, foreign entities trying to shape our political process, and that's not how it's supposed to work. And so I think there was a value for those who wanted to highlight the problem for focusing on that part of the problem, even though if you go and if someone was ever able to look at what had the most impact, that would line up next to all of these other information operations that are happening all the time through partisan media, hyper-partisan media, clickbait sites, other kinds of things, and then domestic activists. We have a whole class of people who think that they will say, we tweeted Trump into the presidency, and these are domestic people who were using social media, and they were using it in creative ways that also might be categorized as disinformation. So I think there was this focus in 2016 because it was easier for us to make sense of and say, hey, that was wrong. But then when you start looking at when it's happening domestically, and right now I think the foreign disinformation has been easier for the platforms to figure out and handle. And though I think it's definitely always happening, I don't think it's as big of a problem in this election as domestic disinformation and domestic information operations. But those are harder to problematize. And there's also places where they're entangled. It is very hard to disentangle the effects of previous information operations, foreign ones, and their current ones from these global networks of activists that are all kind of entangled in ways that it's hard to work out, who actually is funding this and who's also moving this information around, whose objectives is it serving, when there are a lot of these networks have a little bit of foreign and a little bit of domestic working together in different ways.
But
yeah,
let me,
so,
but
go ahead
let me
and ask your
let me
question.
just push you on that point, because like, I'm always a little bit confused by the reaction, and I don't mean to defend the Russians on this, but the reaction to them strikes me as a little bit confused, in the sense that so one complaint is that they're propagating a lot of false information, right? But another complaint is that they shouldn't be involved in our electoral process at all. And in other words, that the problem isn't that they're lying about things. The problem, and of course, a lot of the information they released was not lies. They were actual emails by real people, right? Stolen, but it was true information. And in that sense, the role they were playing was different in motive and shade from what we do here and call journalism. And so my question is the fundamental concern the quality of the information, or is the fundamental concern that the outside actor is, robed in some mask and not revealing their true involvement, playing a role at all? If Liechtenstein got involved in order to run a website that released only true information, call it Liechtensteinins for truth, would we care?
Yeah. So I mean, it's a hard question, and it kind of gets at the issues as I've seen them, especially with the hacking. Is there's a lot of information out there that could be detrimental to people. If everything you ever said on all of your emails were released in certain ways and selectively, there's a lot of different stories that could be told. And so when we think about even the definition of disinformation isn't just false information, it's also misleading. And you can mislead in a couple of different ways, but you can mislead by only releasing certain parts of information without the context around it, or releasing, or stealing information that harms one candidate, but not stealing information and releasing it that harms another candidate. So there's different ways to kind of manipulate the process. And so it's manipulative. It's shaping political opinions, even if it's based on documents that were real, but they were stolen. So I think when we think about stolen documents by a foreign country that are selectively released in order to harm a political candidate, historically, they've actually put in forgeries often into those as well, in ways that you can't tell the difference. In this case, it looks like most of what they put in wasn't forgeries. It was just the emails themselves, but you can see them like kind of selectively having an influence at a particular time. And all of that kind of speaks to, maybe we wouldn't even put it in disinformation, but we put it into the active measures. They're trying to shape the political process in the US and the decisions we make by stealing information and selectively releasing it. Is that different? Is that different? I mean, I think that's a question of what you think a democracy is and how we think of, is this a global participation in the democracy, or do we really think that there are certain kinds of things, especially foreign influence, that we want to treat differently than domestic influence? And it gets back to your earlier question of does it really matter if it's foreign or domestic? Is it really about the techniques that are being used to spread these things versus the the truth value or whatever underneath them? I don't know. I mean, these are hard questions.
But can we get it? I want to switch over after this question. I want to talk about the election integrity partnership and stuff. I think that would be great, and I have it queued up to share my screen. But Ben's question and your answer made me think I think of you as like an empiricist, and you have tons of data that you look at, which I also try to do and make these. But there has been, I used to study cognitive science, and I really have increasingly been moving in the direction of philosophy as I get to the base question of some of these problems, which is as you said, as I think that Ben's problem kind of perfectly illustrates. It's and that you kind of, your answer about narrative was super interesting, because everyone has their own truth, everyone has their own narrative. You can put it out there. There are
Don't say narrative. Bill Barr will get upset at you.
I know he doesn't like that. But I was actually thinking about that. Sorry, when I was when Kate said that. But anyway, I do think that there is this question. So I write, I just spent all of this time inside Facebook, and I spent all of this time observing people, right? And there's tons of stories you could write, and there's tons of different things that you could say, right? And I don't tell all of the stories, because some of them are they would be perfectly relevant to some people and super interesting, but mostly not, and like not really the point or whatever. And like I'm like, am I engaging in misinformation by holding back that truth as like a journalist? Like, of course no one wants to listen to 150 hours of my tapes of my interviews while I was on Facebook, or maybe some people do. But like, what that is, like, that is a part of journalism, is that you back it up with facts, and then you tell a story, you weave a story with those facts that reflects more or less a narrative that you think is true and that your like subjects agree with or disagree with if you're going to do a takedown piece, right? And so like that's kind of like, I'm very interested in your thoughts on that, because this is something I really like struggle with all the time, which is like, how are we ever going to get to an end point? Maybe we won't, on this question. This has just made us all epistemologists in this very fundamental sense, and we don't have the cognitive ability to filter the information as quickly as we need to.
I don't even know where the question is there, but
no question like specifically. I'm just kind of like curious. Like, do you see an end in sight of like kind of some of this, and do you find yourself kind of reaching for philosophy, and is that at all helpful for you?
I wish I had time to reach for philosophy. I think I'm still so buried in the empirical data, and then trying to catch up with the theory behind with theories and some kind of guiding theories that help us understand what we're seeing at this intersection of technology mediated conversations and human behavior. I think we are at an interesting point where things have been getting worse. I mean, there's this cynicism. There's this, are we ever going to really be able to know? We have to kind of rethink even what we mean about evidence and narrative and a lot of, if we talk for too long, I can get myself down the hole with everyone else, and of like, where, how do we get out of this, and is anything even real anyways, and does it even matter? And I think that's actually a kind of a dangerous place a little bit. But I don't know what comes next. I don't know if we continue into this kind of space where we're just kind of trying to figure out what does it mean to know things anymore in these environments, and did we ever know them anyways? And I think that's part of the allure for why people get drawn into some of these spaces of like, oh, we never really knew the truth, and here's an alternative one for us that has these explanations that might be easier than the current one, which is that this is all really, really messy, and political speech has always been messy, and it gets even messier when a foreign entity is able to participate in the same ways that we are, and it gets messy when algorithms are playing a role in mediating these spaces, and that messiness right now has a lot of us very dizzy. And I guess I'm feeling the same thing, and I don't know what comes next.
Yeah.
So when you look at the COVID environment, is there anything like a consistent source of the disinformation, or is it some of it's coming from over here, some of it's coming from over here, some of it just erupts and it's very hard to tell where it comes from? Do we have any sense of all the bullshit about COVID? The president didn't make up hydroxychloroquine, right?
No, it's Chinese government spread that first.
Where's
that
it
was
coming from?
Oh yeah, that initially came out of the Chinese government media was pumping up hydroxychloroquine early on. There was a study from years ago that it had some effect in cells or something, and they saw that opportunistically as well to say, oh look, a cure is coming, and then it just gets picked up by the right-wing media sphere in the U.S. a little bit later. I think the answer to your question is there a single source of disinformation narratives? And I would say that's almost a little bit of the wrong question. I don't think there's a single source.
I didn't mean a single source. I mean
but
a kind of set of locuses, like that you can look at and say, over time, the following locuses are generating misinformation or disinformation on a fairly consistent basis.
I think it's actually coming from different places. So we saw some come out of the anti-vaccine communities. Some of it were coming out of like the far right free, government don't tread on me communities. We saw stuff coming out of like even, other kinds of conspiracy theory communities, and some just coming out of people, trying to figure things out and get it wrong. The thing where there is a pattern is who brings these kind of things at the edges to the attention of everybody. How do these things go viral? How do they move across communities? And that's where we start to see like massive spread. So something like the Plandemic video, which incorporated all these different conspiracy theories and had a star that was going to sort of attack Dr. Fauci, which was politically attractive to people who wanted to damage his reputation. You can see all those forces kind of come together, and then you can see it move from community to community over time using, community to community. You can see it move in the Twitter sphere. It's happening in the Facebook. People move the content from a mom's group, from an anti-vaccine group to a mom's group, and then from somewhere to a QAnon community, and then it begins to burst in these different communities. So I think there's a couple things. There's a set of like first movers and influencers who bring a lot of and we're doing that with COVID-19, brought a lot of the misinformation into the sort of mainstream, or made it more broadly visible. And then there's also these network connections that I think are playing a role and facilitating like sort of massive spreads from one community to another.
Yeah, I think this is, so I'm going to switch from COVID back to the Election Integrity Partnership. I'm going to share my screen here so that people can kind of see this, and I will drop a link to this in the chat. But this is a blog post and a PDF. I called it a report, but like maybe like that I know you have been continue to update this, but I think of it as a report because I think it is a really great kind of metric for measuring and identifying and clarifying different types of election misinformation. You specifically talk about 4 categories of election-related misinformation. And I remember I was like skimming this at first, and then I was like, wait, those are 3 bolded words, not 4. Like, where is the 4th bolded word? And then, of course, you say 3 of these below concern specific harms relating to voters' procedures and suppression. The 4th, which you have to keep scrolling down in this thing and do a good job with your reading comprehension for, is the idea, the 4th type of election-related misinformation is when a candidate falsely claims victory.
Not exactly.
Prematurely claims victory. Is that correct?
I think how we meant to communicate, there's some tension across there, but there were these 3 sort of types of misinformation about procedures that may suppress votes or incite fraud or some of these other kinds of things. But then there's a 4th type that goes underneath a lot of this communication, and that is just trying to undermine trust in the results. So not
trust in the results is a much better way of putting it. I will put and that goes across.
Yeah, that goes across all the different tactics.
I guess this is where I was getting the scenario for it. That like a kind of like
that was an example.
It was an example, but it wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
But yes,
so
it's like everything. So there are 3 types of misinformation, which all are around voter, like basically keeping people from voting or confusing people about voting, and then the 4th one is about confusing people about results.
Yes, and it's sort of like the way I've been thinking about it, and it was hard to communicate in a blog. We had like 19 hands in the blog. I think it's an amazing piece of.
I love this. I think it's actually.
Yeah, and I didn't have.
I think it's an amazing piece of work.
Yeah, I didn't have a strong hand at it, although we were struggling with that. What does it mean to have that 4th category? But what we're trying to do is look at different ways that the integrity of the election will be undermined, and part of that is to suppress votes, to confuse people about when and how to vote, to scare people away from the polls, and then also things around fraud. But what we imagine to be sort of the greatest threats to election integrity are both the execution of some of those strategies to confuse people or to suppress votes, and then almost parallel things that say, look, the process is all messed up, therefore we can't trust the results. And to see that as actually just basically an attack on democracy itself, right? So we can't really, the idea is that it doesn't, the elections don't work, and therefore our democratic way of governing ourselves isn't going to work if people don't trust the results. So when we can see foreign efforts to do this, but we're seeing domestic efforts to do this from people in power in our own country, to say that the results aren't going to be fair, you can't trust the results. Well, this is actually an attack on democracy. And so we're thinking about how do we look for and identify unfounded or misinformation-based arguments or misleading arguments that are meant not to fix problems in our election infrastructure. Absolutely, we should be doing that and highlighting where they're unfair, but actually are being mobilized to undermine our trust in the results as part of a political strategy that might be setting up some other kind of action. Yeah. And could have just long-term detrimental effects on how people perceive, the strength of our country.
Yeah.
The legitimacy of our country. And it's going to be definitely especially difficult because the mail-in ballots, there's already so much confusion being sown, and so much, the mail-in ballots are going to take a while to count. And so there's going to be a period of uncertainty. Unless it's a blowout, we're not going to know the results on election night. This is what I've come to understand from talking to some really smart people. Unless there's a blowout,
or unless it's not, or unless Florida is decisive.
Okay.
Yeah, Nate,
so,
Nate personally. Nate was on.
Yeah.
Talked about this, so it was really great. It was super useful.
Yeah, and I've heard some other. Yeah.
Let's take a question from the audience. Ian, the floor is yours.
Hi. Earlier on, you said
we can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
I can hear him.
Okay. Earlier on, you broke down disinformation into different categories. Now there are penalties for those caught spreading disinformation for financial gain, but disinformation for political gain can have hugely significant outcomes, but does it actually have any meaningful penalties?
I mean, I think that's one of the things is that we've seen so far is the only penalty we've seen is that someone might lose their account. We haven't seen our government take any strong actions against entities for using disinformation against us. As far as I know, I haven't seen any decisive action on that. And certainly, it's a low risk activity if the only thing you're going to lose are your accounts. And even that, isn't up to the task. Like, there's plenty of accounts that are out there spreading disinformation at all times. So yeah, no, I don't think there are meaningful penalties. I think it's part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. I want to go to the next question. Ruth is waiting very patiently, but I want, at some point after Ruth's question, we can maybe circle back quickly to kind of where you see the solutions coming from regulation on this. You are an incredibly fact-based, incredibly descriptive person, and I think it is one of the things that makes your work so concrete and welcome in such a massive field of confusion and no one knowing what's going on. And as you said, you can quickly descend into time is meaningless, life is meaningless, truth is meaningless. But I would like to kind of hear what you think are kind of solutions, and those might differ. And I know you're not a lawyer, but I would kind of I'm curious as to how you feel about that. But Ruth Greenblatt, the floor is yours.
Right. Well, my question has concerns really going back, I would say, at least 20 years in medical research. There's been quite a bit of pressure on the types of studies funded to exclude certain things like the CDC not looking into gun-related morbidity and mortality at all. And research on, say, abortion. So there's been pressure on limiting what studies are done, but then also in terms of findings, there are a number of research institutes that have funded studies that reanalyze existing data in a way that the outcomes support certain points of view. I'll give you one example. A colleague of mine did research in abortion and had found a research institute that got a study published that looked at adverse mental health outcomes of abortion. But what they did was they did not include the data that existed on mental health status prior to abortion. Right. They didn't correct for that. They just included the outcomes. So it would appear that abortion caused
after a fairly significant
problems.
Surgery, like someone has like some,
yeah.
Yeah, and I'll give one other example to comment on.
Well, we actually need it to come to a question.
Well, I think to what degree is a similar trend existing in other fields? And do you have any comment on this kind of misinformation that looks sort of like science, but it's not really?
Yeah, so there's two different pieces.
It's a great question.
Yeah, you have two different pieces here. One is the first one about just how funding shapes science. We already know that's happened. Another interesting case that people might not know is obvious, and one of the reasons that my group ended up in the disinformation space, but we were all funded for doing research during crisis events. But for a long time in my directorate at the National Science Foundation, where I write my grants, you couldn't get anything that talked about politics and social media funded. And so all of the research that would have been done to kind of see some of this stuff coming, 2012 to 2016.
I feel like people are like tripping over themselves to fund that now.
Yeah,
for the last 2 years.
But the National Science Foundation, it was seen as like partisan or political. Yeah, and they didn't want it. They decided not to fund it, and I think they were getting political pressure to not fund it during that time. And so that absolutely shapes science. On the other side, so I think there's some great criticisms of science, and they also can see how science is being manipulated and misused. In the COVID case, all the time we're seeing these preprint papers get pushed out, media pick them up, and that's one way we're seeing sort of science kind of feed misinformation cycles. And before the paper's retracted, it's already spread through cable TV news, and now it's shaped how people see the world. People using the credibility of science to spread information that's not peer reviewed. And then these cases are, science isn't one study. Science is an accumulation of studies that brings a community towards a consensus around a set of ideas. So anyone that's leveraging one study that goes against the grain and saying, this is the one we should all believe. Well, no, you got to do 3 or 4 more studies around that to get, there's no one study that is the whistleblower, or this is the information. You kind of have to follow the community just decides the standards. And yes, sometimes a community gets it wrong and I'll have to move. But this idea that one paper represents the best understanding of science at this time is just something I think we have to disabuse ourselves of somehow. And that's a misunderstanding, I think, across the population. Even as a scientist, we don't always understand that that's
amen.
That science is a community. Yeah.
And I think that one of the things to just close and then kind of turn it to Ben, who is going to be a human rat for a study in whether or not Kate can cure meat without killing people.
Oh my goodness.
But before we go to that, I just really want to foot stomp what you just said, which is listen, there is this one type of what is interesting to me about the problems that you're studying, and I think that it's you're mapping this space and you're kind of putting a way for people to disentangle what is a strategic and purposeful and intentional type of manipulation versus what is just these weird viral things that happen and then get manipulated by strategic elements or whatever. But to your point about something like a bad science paper hits the news cycle and it's halfway, what is it, halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on, type of thing. But to that point, that is about the affordances around all of the internet and communications technology now, and about the lack of friction that like all of the friction that just got deleted like by these communications technologies, and that we're not at all like capable. And it's like sometimes it's less about the purposeful lies that people are trying to spin us and more about like just the fact that we're very angry at the fact that this is not a system that makes sense or like or maps onto our values and like what we want from like
it maps onto
sense?
what we want. Like it maps onto our like
like a dopamine receptor level.
It maps onto our addictions, and those kinds of things. It's optimized for some of the worst traits of human nature, and doesn't really optimize for what is good for us and what we actually want in the long term. And maps onto what feels good in the moment, and keeps us engaged and clicking and resharing, and not necessarily thinking about the implications of our participation.
I feel very guilty right now because I didn't send you any lamb prosciutto, Kate. So.
I know, I'm feeling bad about that too.
So I feel like I'm like, this is a weird thing. Like it feels like a weird dinner party where I'm like, here, you can try this. Yes, you can't try this.
That's okay. I haven't had wine yet either because it's only 3:00. So I'll just have to be a happy participant.
That's your own mistake, Kate. So I can't help you with that.
Well, because it is Erev Rosh Hashanah, we need to end on time today, which means that the lamb prosciutto tasting is going to be brief. But
has Tammy tried it?
No. We are going to try it. We are unveiling the lamb prosciutto, which arrived by FedEx or U.S. Postal Service today.
I used the USPS. God bless them.
Yes, you did. I corrected myself. Here is the lamb prosciutto. This lamb prosciutto was cured by Kate. It smells powerfully of fennel.
It doesn't smell like lamb.
It definitely does. We are going to demonstrate how much we trust Kate, because we are going to consume it here right in front of you.
This feels like telegraphing your thoughts to God is a good way to get him to laugh at you. It is not that thin. Sorry.
It is quite good.
Is it? It's kind of got a nice sweetness, right?
Yeah, it's it's surprising.
It's very flavorful.
It is. It's strong. I would recommend it very highly to people who like strongly flavored cured meats.
Or fennel. It came out very fennel-y.
It does. There is a lot of fennel. I will consume the rest of it, definitely. So I think that people who voted so much on the poll are the winners here. Very impressed with the lamb prosciutto.
Aww.
Definitely going to eat more of it. Thank you for sending it, Kate.
No,
for all of you who doubted that the lamb prosciutto was real, despite Kate's holding it up like this, like holding a leg of lamb by the leg. It is real. Sure. It is quite tasty. To all of you who consider this the beginning of the new year, Shana Tova. For those of you who don't, Shana Tova anyway. It is actually the beginning of the new year, the Jewish New Year, whether you want it to be or not. So it may as well be a happy one. We will be back tomorrow, 22 hours and 59 minutes from now, with great thanks to our awesome guest. This was a really great discussion.
Kate, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
We will be back tomorrow with hopefully fewer tech glitches, one fewer guest because it's just us Saturday, so it's just Kate and me. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we do have lamb prosciutto.
I'm so glad I got there. Okay. Okay. Ben, Happy New Year.
Cheerio.
See you soon.
Yeah. See you all. Thank you.